Hey folks, Stephanie Wade here with the Wade Forward Volume 6. It might not keep that name, and I'm going to be asking all of you for help with the idea of renaming my budding podcast. But first, let me wish everyone a Happy New Year. If you're like me, you feel like a little bit of a fraud when you say that because 2024 was horrible. Yet, if you're like me, you think 2025 is starting out to be much, much worse and maybe the most dangerous year in the history of the Republic. So tough times, but we carry on. You, my loyal listeners, know I try to accentuate the positive wherever I can, and I've got some of that today. In fact, there are two victories I'm going to be talking about towards the end of the podcast. That's the sugar that's going to hopefully get you through what I think is going to be a longer podcast. But I'm going to talk about two victories we had that a lot of you participated in and helped make happen. I want to talk about the name of my podcast. And it's very topical. So I'm recording this on January 8th. And by the way, I apologize for the blurry screen. My lighting isn't great, but it'll have to suffice for now. But as I say, it's January 8th, so it's 2 days after those of us who actually care about democracy remembered January 6th. And the Trump people are doing everything they can to bury that, as is the Supreme Court, as is Eileen Cannon, and they're essentially being lawless. But Merrick Garland is thinking about obeying. He's like, oh, a federal judge ordered it, so I guess I can't release this report that Jack Smith just put out that details how Trump stole, planned to profit from, probably hid, lied, and conducted an elaborate conspiracy to retain classified documents, including top secret classified documents. They're trying to bury that. And Merrick Garland's like, oh, but a federal judge who has no jurisdiction in this case, who's dismissed the case, is saying this can't be released. Merrick Garland, don't be a wimp. And, his failure to prosecute and to bring Jack Smith until almost 2 years into the Biden presidency, his failure to do it while even Donald Trump couldn't defend the actions of January 6th. His failure for 2 years to sit on that before he finally decided to get off his ass and appoint a special prosecutor changed the entire situation. And it effectively brought us the Trump presidency because Trump used those 2 years to create a new narrative and to lie and to lie and to lie and to tell Republicans and their enablers what they wanted to hear, which was, oh no, we didn't do anything wrong. For 2 years, he fed that horse shit to people. And clearly, much of them believed it. Many of them believed it. So today's podcast is about what I see as the essence of this. And it's about Democrats being tougher, smarter, and playing hardball. So the central premise of what I've been trying to do here is to get Democrats to realize where they've been making their mistakes. It's the idea that for, since 1980 at least, since the Reagan's election, we've been living in a Republican ascendancy. So even in those cycles when we win election years, we're still letting Republicans set the terms of debate, and they do that largely by by effectively communicating terms and concepts that Democrats even themselves pick up. This is a tactical argument. I'll get a little more strategic in a bit, but think of George Lakoff. Probably many of you know the author George Lakoff in his famous book, Don't Think of an Elephant. He pointed out that, one of the classic examples of Democrats accepting Republican phrasing and framing, rather, is the term tax relief. And the Republicans just said it so consistently, so often, that reporters picked it up, and then when reporters started putting in their questions, and Democrats just innocently started using the same term. And they would say things like, I'm for middle class tax relief. The problem is, if you accept the Republican framing and you use the term tax relief, you've immediately accepted the Republican terms of the debate. And essentially, you've characterized taxes as a pox, as a horrible burden from which you must be relieved, tax relief. So it doesn't matter if you say, I'm for middle class tax relief, you're already gutting your own argument, right? Democrats want to cut taxes to the bone and have a smaller government. Republicans want to cut taxes to the bone and have a smaller government. And they don't mind. And when they can't do that, they'll spend profligately to up the deficit, but then continue to cut taxes. And so the deficit grows and grows and grows, and Republicans say it's the Democrats' fault. Why do we accept those terms? Why don't Democrats say, instead of tax relief, why don't they say tax fairness, tax fairness, tax fairness, tax fairness over and over and over again? And talk about constantly beating people over the head about how much, what breaks and what kind of money Elon Musk and all the billionaires in Trump's proposed cabinet are going to get when they renew these Trump tax cuts. So let me give you another example of where, tactics where Democrats are completely missing the mark. This week there was a story about Brett Favre, and Brett Favre was complaining vociferously about who President Biden chose in his waning days of his administration, who he was awarding the Presidential Medal of Freedom to. Brett Favre complained about George Soros. Well, that's an interesting point, right? Democrats, they just said, Brett Favre, well, that's ridiculous. Who's listening to Brett Favre? Brett Favre's a, unintellectual football player who's probably been hit in the head too many times. And what's more, he's a complete crook who's embezzled millions of dollars, and this has been proven. And so, because he's a crook, who would listen to him? And so they laugh it off and don't think twice about it. We need to be emulating that, because you see what Brett Favre is doing, and really probably the people who told Brett Favre to say these things and then aired them over Fox News and beamed them out to all sorts of sports channels and all sorts of talk radio and all sorts of sports shows and sports podcasts. See, the thing is, Democrats aren't going to listen to Brett Favre on the economy, but there's a whole segment of low information voters who eschew politics, don't watch it, but they love football and they love sports, and they know exactly who Brett Favre is. And they probably don't even know about the scandals and the embezzlement. And if they did, they probably don't care, because they only care about football. But what they like is that Brett Favre, a tough guy, Brett Favre, quarterback, my kind of guy, is out there telling them what to think. And it breaks through. It breaks through in a way that Democrats going to the New York Times and writing an op-ed and getting on CNN think that they're breaking through. No, they're not breaking through. So let me give some examples of what Democrats ought to be doing to fight fire with fire. Democrats should be finding people who support Democrats who are prominent outside of politics and get them to be the voice of our messaging. Get Dwayne Wade to do a sports telecast, or go on Joe Rogan, someplace outside of CNN and the liberal bubble, and get him to do an interview. He can talk about basketball and life and just shoot the crap. But make sure that he talks about his transgender kid, and, for instance, says he doesn't want his transgender kid to be abused going to the restroom because of these horrible bathroom bills. Then make sure we get a clip of that and put it out and let it go viral, and have our elected officials and other people who are influencers and everybody in the party start sending that out so everybody sees that clip again and again and again. But that breaks through, because there are plenty of people who know, admire, and respect Dwayne Wade that don't tune into politics, that don't read the paper, that get their news from Joe Rogan and Fox News. So find another way to talk to them. We should try and get Brian Sitnick's mom booked on Randy Randerson's podcast, Dip and Rip. Dip and Rip is one of the most popular podcasts in America, and it's about tattoos. Well, it's a perfect story for them, or to have a segment on Dip and Rip, because Randy Sicknick's mom, at 70 years of age, got a tattoo on her forearm of her dead son's badge. The Capitol Police officer, Brian Sicknick, who was killed by the scummy pro-Trump rioters on January 6th, has a tattoo on her forearm of her dead son's badge. That's an interesting story for a podcast about tattoos. And guess what? That guy runs a tattoo parlor in Oklahoma. This is a way to break through to a demographic that doesn't hear from us. And we need to get our most effective communicators booked on shows like Joe Rogan's show and in these odd little smaller podcasts, but not just podcasts, talk radio shows. Get out to people who we wouldn't always get to speak to. You know, people like AOC, people like Bernie Sanders, people like Gavin Newsom. Even if you don't think they're too left, at least if they're effective communicators that punch back, that's what Democrats need. Get LL Cool J on rap podcasts, talking about and radio stations that play rap and hip hop. Get LL Cool J on talking about music and rap and his past and his history and maybe what kind of food he likes, but make sure that when he's booked on those, that he gets before he agrees to do the interview, he wants to make sure that the story includes him having his say about Kid Rock and laughing at Kid Rock and ridiculing him, saying how weak his rhymes are, and it's just as weak as his shooting cans of Bud Light and making himself look like a mass shooter because he doesn't like trans people. Face the Nation, NPR, that just ain't getting it, people. We need to find better ways of communicating all the time. We need to make better use of a guy like Tim Alberta. He's the ally, the great ally, who he's an evangelical Christian who wrote the book, The Kingdom, the Power, and the Glory, which talks about how evangelical Christianity is being hijacked by this false god of white nationalism, and he's ripping it apart. But right now, he's only doing it on like the Michael Steele podcast and CNN and the Daily Blast. He doesn't need to talk to us. He needs to talk to evangelical Christians. So why can't we book him on a show like Joe Thorne's and Jimmy Fallon's Doctrine and Devotion? That's a Christian show. Get him on there, have him debate some white nationalist Christian preacher, but speak to evangelicals on a show where you're going to reach them. Not a political show, but a religious show. Why doesn't the Democratic establishment and our Democratic leaders, the Hakeem Jeffries, the Nancy Pelosi's, why aren't they adopting these tactics? Fighting fire with fire, hitting the Republicans the way they hit us. Why aren't they doing that? Well, it's because they're a bunch of eggheads. The kids who are in AP Math and AP Bio and AP English, and then they went to selective colleges, and now they think, I'm a philosopher king, and what I need to do is get on, NPR and CNN, and you see, we have better policies that poll more popular, and they are, because they're better for people, and I'm with you. That's why I'm a Democrat, because our policies are better, and if people understand them, they'll think they're better too, because when you explain the individual policies, we win every time. What's the problem? Because we don't communicate them well, right? How's that working out for us, Mr. and Mrs. Philosopher Kings and Queens? But, all that's still about tactics, right? We need to think about strategy. And tactics flow from grand strategy. That's the way it's supposed to work, people. And the grand strategy is off. The problem is, Democrats, going back to Jimmy Carter, who we're going to put in the ground and was certainly a saint, but Jimmy Carter, his presidency largely failed because he came across the American people as weak. And that has increasingly become the toxic brand. Weak leadership is what we look like. Didn't help that Joe Biden looked really, really weak and does. He's a frail old man, right? So that's a strategic problem. And then we come out with our, I'm a philosopher king arguments only on CNN, and nobody sees us as strong. Nobody likes a weak leader. And you see, the problem is our people, our leaders, are conflict averse. They keep thinking if they just come up with the right arguments, eventually they'll just, the persuasion of the argument will win. And they don't like conflict. They run from it. They want to talk about bipartisanship. Yeah, well, not when somebody's shoving a gun in your face. No, we need to fight. Politics is about conflict over ideas. So we need to join the fight, not sit around and hope that our great policy is going to win the day. We need to fight. And never, ever more so than when you're fighting against amoral bullies who'll do anything they need to win. Too many Democratic leaders want comedy. They want us all to get along and have an era of good feelings. Ain't gonna happen, folks. Not gonna happen. Even to the extent, why did Joe Biden win in 2020? Because he looked stronger than Trump, and people remembered how asinine Trump looked and how badly he mismanaged the COVID crisis and how many people died because of his horrible leadership and because he was an idiot who told you to drink bleach and took a Sharpie to try and change the path of a hurricane, right? But Joe Biden was scrappy, and he talked about being Scrappy Joe, and he said he could beat Trump in a push-up contest, and everybody knew he could. Now, he could do that in 2020. Clearly, by 2024, he couldn't do that. That's one of the big reasons he was not up to the job. And there are some Democrats out there who, show it, who do have that fight. You see it in Gretchen Whitmer, Gavin Newsom, AOC, Bernie, definitely Bernie. Not a Democrat officially, but definitely Bernie. Never wavers off his message, never gives an inch. Fight, fight, fight all the time. That's why he was a great rival to Trump. I supported Bernie in both elections. His politics are more left than mine, but he fights and he has principles and he doesn't back down on them. And those principles are about helping the middle class, and everybody goddamn believes him. That's what we need. We need leaders like that. And, I'll tell you who our Democratic leaders ought to really be looking at. They should be looking at the state level transgender and gender nonconforming elected officials who are really taking the fight to the enemy. They show you how it's done. Virginia State Senator Donica Rome, Minnesota Assembly Member Lee Finke, Oklahoma Assembly Member Maury Turner, or my personal hero, Montana Representative Zoe Zephyr. Zoe Zephyr gets elected to the Montana House, and right away she gets into the fight with standing up against a bill that denied minors gender-affirming care. And she came out strong, and she said, if you do this, you're going to have blood of kids on your hands. And they didn't like that, so they sanctioned her. And here's what happened. Zoe Zephyr got reelected. And then, after she got reelected, they asked the leader of the Montana House, hey, are you going to pass a Nancy Mace-like bill and target Zoe Zephyr from using the bathrooms? He said, no, that'll just make her more powerful. And what did we learn from this? We learned that fighting works. She gained respect from her constituents and her enemies alike. This is exactly what my op-ed that appeared in LGBTQ Nation and the MSN network. This is what that was about. It was about, if we fight on trans issues, we may not win every battle, but we'll at least win people's respect. I'm going to repost that op-ed in the comments, and if you haven't read it, I hope you'll take a look. It's a quick 3-minute read, but suffice it to say and to summarize, I criticized Sarah McBride along with other Democrats, but Sarah McBride is the exemplar of having no fight. Sarah McBride, if you didn't already know it, was recently elected from the state of Delaware to Congress, and she is the highest-ranking transgender elected official in the country and the first transgender person ever elected to a federal office. But my op-ed, the one I'm going to repost in the comments, argues that she's an exemplar of lacking this will and ability and to fight and engage. and that it's hurting transgender people. And more importantly, it's hurting all Democrats. Within days of McBride's historic victory, Republican Congresswoman and notorious media whore Nancy Mace targeted her specifically, called a news conference to do it, and said that she was going to make sure that the bathrooms in the Capitol were restricted by sex assigned at birth. And she said she was specifically doing it to target. So she did it specifically to target Mace, but then immediately extended the concept and authored legislation that I'm sure will be taken up in the House very soon to have a national bathroom bill that would govern every single federal facility in the United States, from your Social Security office to a post office to your national parks to military installations, and it would do the same thing and say that transgender or gender nonconforming people will have to use the wrong goddamn bathroom, right? And what was Nancy Mace's response to all this? I didn't get elected and come here to talk about bathrooms. And Hakeem Jeffries, the Democratic leader in the House, what did he say? He wouldn't even say the word transgender. Neither would McBride. Jeffries' response was, "This Republicans, this is what you want to talk about." That was it. That's it. And wouldn't say the word transgender. And think about Kamala Harris. In many ways, she ran a brilliant campaign, but it failed because over and over again she was evasive and looked weak because her handlers told her not to talk about issues that were unpopular. And so when confronted, she sounded weak and evasive. And she's not a weak and evasive person. She can be really strong. She's a prosecutor. But she went with the Democratic playbook. And so, for instance, when she was pressed on the issue of whether the country should be paying for transgender or gender-affirming care, including surgeries for people who are incarcerated or being held as illegal aliens, she wouldn't even say the word transgender in response and simply said, "I'll follow the law. I'll follow the law." Well, that's a boneheaded answer. You're saying what you're going to do, but you're also saying, I'm embarrassed about it and I'm afraid to defend it. And in the postmortem, we've come to find out that, they had effective quips and answers to that, but they didn't poll well. Well, even if it doesn't poll well, it's a lot better to be strong and wrong than weak and right. So Sarah McBride is asked about this national bathroom bill that will subject every gender nonconforming and transgender person, and by the way, a lot of cisgender, that is, perfectly aligned with how they were assigned at birth, but maybe they just look a little too butch to be in the women's bathroom. And it's going to subject all those people to insult, shame, and literally physical danger. But Sarah McBride won't talk about that because she wasn't elected to talk about bathrooms. Well, everybody in America knows what Sarah McBride's position is on this. The fact that she won't talk about it when it's a real and present danger to people like her, to people like me, but especially to a lot more vulnerable people, like kids or young people. Yeah, when she won't do that, it just says it's the epitome of weakness. You know what your position is. We know what your position is, but you won't defend it. You're afraid of it. It's not just that you lose on that issue. It's that people say, who on earth are you going to stand for? If you can't even stand up for yourself, how are you going to fight for, my rights to a fair wage or fair taxation? How are you going to do it? Because you don't know how to fight. Now, I know I'm being hard on Sarah McBride, right? But I want you to know, I respect her. I respect her intelligence. I respect her eloquence. I respect her desire to serve. And I even respect and admire the groundbreaking achievement of her election. But being the first, being the exemplar, the highest ranking, member of a persecuted minority has certain responsibilities. And the first and most important of these is to stand up and unequivocally demand your rights. Even when you don't have the votes, even when it's unpopular, even when your higher ups beg and bully you not to speak and say, sit on your hands, you fight, you stand up. You do that because you will never have rights that you don't have the courage to demand. But you do it, it's not just about trans people, it's about the Democratic brand. If you, Sarah McBride, a transgender woman and the highest ranking transgender person in America, can't unequivocally defend basic rights, civil liberties, and safety of transgender people, what are you doing to the entire brand of the Democratic Party? We all look weak because of that, right? Every Democrat looks weak. Every Democrat that supported transgender rights in every way, if you run from that fight, if you don't have the courage and the strength and the ideas and the conviction and the eloquence to wage that fight, every other Democrat looks weak. Every Democrat that's ever been a transgender ally or been on our side on those issues now looks weaker. You're saying that we're weak. We can be a big tent. We can, tolerate an occasional Seth Moulton who breaks ranks with us on, trans girls and trans women in sports. It's not the end of the world. But if Hakeem Jeffries, if Kamala Harris, and Lord knows, if Sarah McBride, the highest ranking transgender elected official in the country, the first ever elected to Congress, if she can't defend those rights, we not only look weak, we are weak. But why can't Sarah see that? Why does she lack the grit and the fight? Why can't she project her truth? Remember earlier on, I said she's emblematic of a broader problem in the culture of the Democratic Party and its poor strategy, a strategy that doesn't project strength. It's because Sarah is the ultimate product of this culture. Sarah is somebody who wanted to go into politics from a very young age. When she was still a teenager, she was rehearsing political speeches in the mirror and getting to know the governor and the attorney general of the state of Delaware. And at every step of the way in her progression, from the time she was a tween, through her teens, through college, at every step of the way, that Democratic establishment fed her the wrong incentives. She goes to a performing arts magnet high school and graduates, and like her advanced degreed parents, goes to a selective college, American University, where as a politically well-connected and precocious and extremely ambitious young Democrat, she's rather easily elected to be president of the student body. And then in 2012, when she comes out, still in college, comes out in the student newspaper and explains that she's transgender. But it isn't just covered in the student newspaper like a normal, university president of the student body's big announcement would be. She's so well connected that it's covered by NPR, Huffington Post, even Lady Gaga's foundation makes a big deal out of it. Clearly because she's a big deal. And she receives congratulatory messages, not just from her friends or parents, but from Delaware Governor Jack Markle and her two greatest patrons, then Attorney General for the state of Delaware, Beau Biden, and then sitting Vice President of the United States, Joe Biden. That same year, 2012, she's awarded a really prestigious internship at the White House, where she becomes the first openly transgender person ever to work at the White House. Then come really plum jobs, Center for American Progress, Human Rights Campaign, and then speaking tours. She's brought in to give speeches at liberal colleges and universities, at LGBT organizations, HRC's Los Angeles gala. She even gets a TED Talk. In 2015, there's an article in the New Statesman, just 3 years out of college, that predicts that she'll be the first high-ranking elected official in the history of the United States. Then in 2016, another big first. She's selected to give a speech at the Democratic National Convention. So by 2018, when she writes her book, Tomorrow Will Be Different, a book that, by the way, the foreword to that book was written by Joe Biden himself, a glowing foreword. So when she writes that book in 2018, it's clear to me and every other queer politico in America that she's being set up to run first for the Delaware State House, and from there as a stepping stone to be the first transgender person ever elected to Congress. It's obvious, people are talking about it. That's where they're headed. That's it. She's been anointed. You know, the establishment has spoken. She's the comer. She's going to get there. But what's missing from this admittedly quite impressive list of accomplishments and a very bright and talented person? But what's missing? I won't say that she's never suffered. I mean, certainly she lost the love of her life, the brilliant LGBTQ rights attorney Andrew Cray, who died tragically of cancer just days after they were married. That was heartbreaking, and she had cared for him for almost 2 years during his illness. And then there's coming out. I mean, in her case, certainly she had a pretty privileged coming out. I mean, there was all this favorable press coverage and accolades from some of the highest ranking Democratic elected officials in the country. Yeah, but even so, coming out is hard. And, you know, nobody in transphobic America ever has it easy once you tell the world you're transgender. But what is entirely missing is conflict of any kind of fighting. She didn't play, contact sports. By all accounts, her academic life seemed charmed. And the only jobs she ever had were safely, deeply inside, the liberal political bubble where she was a star. Of course, like every other publicly out transgender figure in America, she received her fair share of online hate and nasty comments. But, she never went to a job where, a blue collar job where she was in these safe, super safe Dem bubbles where there were no conflicts. And, those nice, super well educated former AP students, they didn't fight. And if there was any kind of discrimination, the boss would quash it. What about going to a blue collar job where maybe the boss is the one that harasses you or fights? She never had the very common experience that most transgender women and transgender men have faced of, losing a job because it's because you're transgender, or not getting taken in a job because you're transgender. Remember, she's a star. She's got the establishment behind her 110%. And what has she learned? The incentives have taught her, if she gets good grades, if she learns to speak like the other Democrats, learns the talking points, and listens to all these mentors who love her so much, well, the accomplishments just keep coming and coming and coming. She never had the very common experience that most transgender women and transgender men have faced of, losing a job because it's because you're transgender, or not getting taken in a job because you're transgender. Remember, she's a star. She's got the establishment behind her 110%. And what has she learned? The incentives have taught her, if she gets good grades, if she learns to speak like the other Democrats, learns the talking points, and listens to all these mentors who love her so much, well, the accomplishments just keep coming and coming and coming. She's learned you manage up well, you do what your Democratic mentors tell you to do every time, and the world is your oyster. It's a recipe for creating your typical Democrat who's conflict averse. So yeah, I'm sure that Sarah, has forgotten more about being a legislator than I'll ever know. And she's a good parliamentarian, and she's going to write, brilliant legislation, and she's going to be, a very effective member on the committees she's assigned to. But if she can't figure out some way on the fly in this job how to fight, she's setting transgender people and gender nonconforming people back horribly. And more importantly, she's hurting the whole Democratic Party by projecting weakness. These blue-collar and male voters that Democrats have been hemorrhaging for 40 years, they want a champion, somebody who stands up and fights for them. But what we get is, a long line of Democratic leaders who are so risk and conflict averse that what they see is an entire party that doesn't know how to stand up and fight for anything or anyone. Understand it this way, since we're talking about this issue, about transgender rights, right? Even the bigot curious, or even the openly bigoted people who don't like trans people, they're human, and they cast ballots all the time for people they don't 100% agree with on every issue, right? But they never want to cast a vote for a weak leader. And that's, unfortunately, what Democrats seem to always look like as a brand, as a party. And remember, it's decades of this. I mean, as much as I respect and admire the decency of Jimmy Carter and all the things he did in his post-presidency, and will even admit there are many things like negotiating an effective turnover of the Panama Canal, which was a brilliant move, which helped us out enormously in Latin America, and that now Trump wants to fuck up. Carter did a lot of great things. He was certainly right on alternative energy. He had the right policies, at least on that. And I think on a lot of things, However, he projected weakness. His response to an Arab oil embargo was to put on a cardigan and give a fireside chat. That did not impress people as leading with strength. When the Russians invaded Afghanistan, his response was, well, we're going to boycott your Olympics. When his handlers pointed out that, he wasn't doing so great with people because he seemed too pious, he tried to do a Playboy interview and admitted that he had lust in his heart, and he made himself a laughingstock. I mean, I love the man. I respect the man, but he projected weakness. Walter Mondale, his vice president, runs for president. And Carter, was so tainted by this perception of weakness compared to Reagan's projection of strength that he was dead in the water. Michael Dukakis going against George H.W. Bush, getting called out as a wimp for, and then tries to fix it by riding in a tank and comes across looking like a bobblehead doll and gets made fun of for it. Again, great man, thoughtful, Mondale too. They're decent people. They just don't know how to project strength. And then you got Bill Clinton. He's certainly a more popular and charismatic leader. And he's willing to throw a couple of missiles around the third world. Not above that. And, he can be sharp-elbowed with his political opponents. But also look at it this way. The first 100 days of his presidency were a disaster. He tried to lead from a liberal point of view and tried to pass a national health care system. Blew up in his face. Then his defense secretary, with his blessing, Les Aspin, tries to end the ban on gay military service. And he completely folds like a cheap beach chair. There's opposition from veterans groups and, generals, and he just completely folds. And you get don't ask, don't tell, which is terrible. And really, by 1993, a year into his presidency, he's completely reversed all his positions. Now he thinks NAFTA, which is a Republican idea, is great. We're still paying for that one. It makes Democrats say we're the party of the working people. Well, he becomes the face of NAFTA, which Republicans have been pushing for that kind of free trade stuff, and Democrats have been fighting it for decades. He just flips on it. In fact, he hires David Gergen, a former Nixon speechwriter, a former Ford administration official. and a former Reagan official. He hires him to be his like senior advisor, and his entire presidency changes overnight. A year into the presidency, and suddenly it's welfare reform and the end of big government and three strikes laws, and talking about suppose with racist twinge about predator kids, and and suddenly it's his entire agenda is a conservative agenda that does not help the Democratic cause. It looks like you're feckless. You cut and run on people. And then there was Al Gore, another really decent man, but couldn't project strength and flip-flops twice on, a recount for his presidential campaign. John Kerry, he is a really brave warrior who earned medals for valor in Vietnam. But first, he lets himself in a presidential campaign get painted as, they lie about him, and he doesn't have an effective response. Remember Swift Boats for Truth, and they found some people who are ardent Republicans who are willing to lie and say that he was a coward in combat. He never effectively fought back. He didn't take the gloves off, right? Not projecting strength, Or how about, in 1992, he votes against the Iraq or the Persian Gulf War. Says it's immoral. Well, that was a pretty good case for that one. But then, in 2003, he votes in favor of the Iraq War, a war of choice that we all see now as terrible. And even then, I was against that war. I bet a lot of you were against that war. Well, he's thinking that that's going to help him. No. Even President Obama was my favorite president of my lifetime. I mean, he was a waffler on some important things too. He folded for a long time on gay marriage and, wanted civil unions. Even bigger, when he came in the financial crisis in 2008, he says, he wanted to nationalize the bank, but, like Sarah McBride, he'd come up through all these elite institutions. And so when Larry Summers and Geithner, his heroes, his mentors, told him, "Oh, you can't do that," he said, "Oh, I guess I won't do that." Right? Same thing on healthcare. Instead of pushing through universal payer, right at a crisis when people were desperate for government help, and he had the votes, he backed off and he came up with Obamacare, which I'm glad we at least got Obamacare, and it's popular now, but we could have gotten more. And again, I want to come back to that, with Obama, Democrats are supposed to be the party of the working people. But in the bailout, in the 2008-2009 bailout, who paid? Who went to jail? Why didn't all those stockholders have to lose their shirts when those banks went belly up, and the government, the taxpayer, had to bail them out? That's because we were afraid of the conflict, because we were afraid that Republicans and bankers would be upset with us. Yeah, well, who was really upset was rank and file Democratic voters who were more who were starting to drift further and further away from us because we didn't seem to fight for them or for regular people. Or the 2014 Russian invasion of the Crimea, where he slapped on some sanctions and kind of let it go. Or in the midst of the Syrian civil war, he tells the Assad regime very publicly and forcefully, if the Assad regime uses chemical weapons against their own people, that would be a red line that he better not cross. And then they blatantly crossed it and started gassing their own people like it's cool. And Obama just said, again, you got to project strength. And I want to touch on something else about this Democratic Party not projecting strength problem. It's gendered. As we know, the Democratic Party has increasingly become a party supported overwhelmingly by females, and more men are going to the Republican Party, and it's been happening since Nixon, right? And I want to tell you a fundamental reason why I think that is. In our gender stereotypes, in the way women are conditioned in America, and in the facts of a patriarchal America, conflict, anger, violence are things that women experience all the time as the objects of, and they're coached never to show anger. And what's more, that it's logical that lots of women in America, in our patriarchal system, have a lot of trouble expressing anger, being forthright. Not all women. I know some really strong women, but I think there's a gendered side of this that democratic politics, and I'm with the women. I mean, I'm in the Democratic Party because it is a party that cares about people and about working people and a strong social safety net and fair taxation. But this is a problem, and we're going to have to get over it. Now, I don't want to be misunderstood, and I'm not saying that we should become that which we're fighting. That we should become fact-denying, violence-prone, frothing at the mouth, angry people like the Trumpists were fighting. No, but we need to be unafraid of conflicts, to state our position clearly and firmly and articulately and without embarrassment, and be proud in our positions. And then I think we need to respond to Republicans as the happy warriors with, derision and making fun of them, making them look like the small, petty people they are, right? I mean, and if you think about it, these are some, laughable people like Elon Musk, Ramaswamy, who, basically came out with this, jocks bullied me in high school, so I want to bring in engineers because America's got too many jocks. Oh God, stop working out your social issues, Vivek. But Elon Musk, Donald Trump, oh my God, what a loser, So find those weak points and make fun of them, and one thing I hope to God Democrats in Washington are planning is right now when they propose the tax cuts, having a graphic of each billionaire in the Trump administration and how much they stand to save by these tax cuts. And then, I want to see that. And the American people need to see it. And I'm not saying that, we can't horse trade with the Republicans on an issue here or there, but we can't make bipartisanship an end in itself, not with these people. So where there's something where we can get them to agree to something we like, great. But we're not giving the store away anymore, right? And if the Republicans want to run the economy into the ground, well, we got to make sure they pay for that and that we don't dig their bacon out of the fire. So I know this has been a long, discursive, rambling conversation tonight. I'm sorry I didn't edit it better, but we're just about at the end here, peoples. So if you've made it this far, this is what I would like you to do. I'd like you to think about the two propositions I'm making here. Do you agree with me that the Democratic Party and progressive people have been on the losing side of politics and policy debates since the 1980s, and that that's happening not because our policies are bad or unpopular, rather the opposite. The reason we've been losing is because our policies, or not because of our policies, but because of the way we communicate them and because we project weakness. So I want your feedback on that proposition. Do you agree with me on that? And whether you agree with me or not, I'm thinking of changing the name of my podcast, and I want to turn it into a podcast. I want to settle on a name and get a couple other things worked out before I pick a podcasting platform and actually start putting my regular pods out of the world. But so I'd like your help with naming the podcast. I'm thinking of Brave New Dems, or Muscular Liberalism, or Dems Who Fight and Win. So those are my three ideas right now. Oh, and one other one for Muscular Democrats. So again, and I'll put them in the chat, but Brave New Dems, Muscular Liberalism, Dems Who Fight and Win, and Muscular Democrats. So I would like your feedback on those, and I would also like if people have other suggestions for what they for what they think I ought to rename my show, and I'd really like to hear from you. And finally, I just want to conclude, folks, with I promised you at the beginning 2 really happy things, and a lot of you have been helping on this. The first I'll mention is President Biden announced that he's implementing the Offshore Continental Lands Act, an obscure piece of legislation that allows him to designate any part of the our coastline out to the farthest limits of the continental shelf off limits to oil drilling and gas exploration. And he's done that. So that's something I asked a lot of you to lobby on. I know you wrote the White House, and there were a lot of large environmental advocacy groups involved too. But every one of us who's on this podcast that worked at that, thank you very much. And let's all take pride in that victory. And then the other is a lot of you know I've been lobbying for many years for LGBT discharge reform. That is for helping veterans who were dishonorably discharged and had their lives ruined and couldn't get gainful employment because they were carrying a dishonorable discharge, which is like a felony. Those people have no provision has been made for them. Even though we've ended the prohibition on gay service, we've done almost nothing for the people who are kicked out. And some of you may know that I've complained that the Biden administration made a big deal out of it this past June and said they were going to fix it all and they were going to do it proactively. Yeah, to date, 8 veterans have received discharge upgrades because of what Biden administration did. However, this week in Northern California, and I'll put a link in the chat, but this week in Northern California, in federal court, a judge ruled that the Department of Defense has to start fixing these discharges, that it must be done expeditiously, and that it needs to be done with much less effort on the part of the petitioners who are looking to have their upgrades done. I don't think it's going to help every veteran, that was affected or was kicked out because they were gay, but it's going to be a major step forward. And none of us, I don't think, had anything to do with that court case, but we've been raising the tenor of this for several years. And I know several people who listen to my podcast have been working on it. So I wanted to thank you and also congratulate you, and we can all share in that too. So thanks. Sorry it was so long. I really do want to hear from you, and we'll talk on a shorter podcast, I promise, soon.